Well, tax day happens every year, but tax returns have made news since U.S. President Donald Trump became the first president in 40 years to not release his publicly. Well, joining me now is Jeff Kupfer, an adjunct professor at Carnegie Mellon University. He was also former special assistant to the president for economic policy under George W. Bush. Welcome to the show.
Happy to be here. Thanks.
So what do we know about how President Trump's tax reforms are shaping up so far?
Well, President Trump made tax issues a big deal during the campaign in that he promised a massive tax cut, both for the middle class and for corporations to reform the corporate tax code. And in his speech to Congress at the beginning of February, he also reiterated how important it was. He said he was getting his economic team to work on tax reform plans, and he identified a few areas where he really wanted to pay attention to. One being massive tax relief for the middle class, and two, leveling the playing field for American businesses.
Now, a lot of people were wondering when they were going to see more meat on the bones, so this could be perhaps what they're looking at. So in terms of expectations, what do you think will be the key things they can take away from his proposals? Well,
he hasn't, as you point out, he made some proposals during the campaign, but since he's been in office, he really hasn't put out detailed proposals about what he thinks tax reform should look like. However, he has been, and his team has been in constant communications with members of the House of Representatives and the leadership of the House of Representatives, and they have put out a very detailed proposal, which would really do a few things. Besides streamlining and making much less complex the U.S. tax system in general for individuals and for corporations, it would also lower the corporate tax rate and begin to, as I said before, level the playing field for U.S. businesses as compared to their foreign counterparts.
Now let's also look at the global community. What could the potential impact be for them, and even perhaps in how they view operating and doing business in the U.S.?
Okay, so what President Trump and the House leadership want to do is really make the U.S. the most attractive place for businesses to locate, both for their operations and for their headquarters. And right now, the U.S. has what's called a worldwide tax system. We're the only member of the G7 that has a worldwide tax system. All other countries in the G7 have what's called a territorial tax system, which means that the taxes are just imposed at that national level, whereas the U.S. taxes income everywhere in the world for U.S. companies. And so what President Trump and the House want to do is to change our tax system so that we're more conform with some of these other countries and also make it more efficient and effective. And what that would do over time would make it more attractive for businesses to retain their operations in the United States and to make the U.S. really a manufacturing powerhouse.
Now, we know that Wall Street has pretty much been chomping at the bit, waiting for these tax reforms. What do you think the corporate reaction might be?
Well, what we've seen is that all members of the business community are really in favor of tax reform. We haven't had tax reform, significant tax reform in the United States since 1986. So it's been 31 years since President Reagan pushed through tax reform. So the tax code is really anti-competitive now. And as we've seen in other places around the world, since 2003, the maximum tax rate for other industrialized countries around the world has come down from about 30% to 23%. Here in the United States, it's actually gone in the other direction. So it's at 39% compared to the average, which is 25% around the world. So all businesses want to see some sort of tax reform. You have a little split, as one would expect, as the specifics of the tax reform proposal come out there, and certain members of the business community are more in favor of certain provisions than other members of the business community.
Naturally. Now, let's look at something interesting. Oxfam's recent report about U.S. companies that they estimate have $1.6 trillion parked in offshore tax havens to really circumvent the U.S. tax system. How does the U.S. get that money repatriated, and what are the biggest challenges?
Well, as a first point, the money that is overseas from the U.S. is there because of the design of the U.S. tax system. Most of that money, if not all of that money, is there legally just for companies taking advantage of the various provisions of the U.S. tax system. And because we do tax income worldwide, what those companies want to do is defer U.S. taxes by leaving it in some of those lower tax areas. What the hope is of the tax reform proposal is by lowering U.S. rates, there will be more incentive for these companies to bring back their money, to not park it in some of these other places. The proposals also have what they call a deemed repatriation, which basically means that the companies will pay a certain low rate and be able to bring all that money back to the U.S. And one would hope that if 1.6 trillion or 2 trillion by other estimates begins to come back into the U.S., we'll see increased economic activity back here at home.
And what does that mean in terms of transparency, though? And what could we see in terms of mergers and acquisitions?
Well, most of the companies put out in their annual reports where that money is and how much of that money is overseas from a transparency standpoint. As the money begins to come back, companies will have more firepower to do a variety of different things that businesses can do, whether that's mergers or acquisitions, whether that's hiring more workers, whether that's increasing their dividends. So the net result of bringing that money back to the U.S. would be a net positive for the United States, any way you look at it.
Would expect nothing less from a business-savvy president. Thank you so much, Jeff Kupfer, adjunct professor at Carnegie Mellon University.